American Politics Today by Bianco and Canon, Chapter 11, Part 1, Presidency. Are there limits on power? This is when somebody is the President of the United States, the authority in total, and that's the way it's got to be. It's total. It's total, and that's the way it's got to be. And the governors know that. President Donald Trump in COVID-19 briefing, April 13th, 2020. I will be speaking to all 50 governors very shortly, and I will then be authorizing each individual governor of each individual state to implement a reopening and a very powerful reopening plan of their state at a time in a manner as most appropriate. President Donald Trump in COVID-19 briefing, April 14th, 2020. Outlining the major achievements of Donald Trump's 4 years in office illustrates the immense power of the presidency. Trump commanded the most powerful military forces on earth and pushed through budget increases that will make them even stronger. Working with Republicans in Congress, Trump enacted the largest tax cut in American history. His directives transformed federal policy in areas such as immigration, the environment, the federal regulations, and he placed himself at the center of the government's response to COVID-19. Personally fielding calls from state and local officials for allocations of federal medical supplies. A look at the personal style that Trump brought to the office, too, seems to underline its power. Trump behaved very differently compared to his predecessors. He hired and fired people working at the highest levels of government, seemingly at whim. Anything he said, even an offhand comment or tweet, became the focus of public attention. He relied on social media to communicate directly with the American people, responded to criticism with strong personal attacks, made abrupt, radical changes in America's domestic and foreign policy, routinely ignored presidential traditions and norms, pushed the boundaries of formal and informal limits on presidential authority, and made personal loyalty a dominant criterion for his appointees. Yet 2 quotes at the beginning of this chapter illustrate that there are fundamental limits to presidential power, and one day Trump claimed authority to determine when states would ease COVID-19 lockdown and social distancing regulations. The very next day, Trump said he would authorize governors to act as they thought best. A face-to-face way act as they thought best, a face-saving way to acknowledge the constitutional reality that this decision lies with the states. Other events during Trump's presidency illustrate limits on presidential power. While Trump frequently threatened to end the Justice Department's investigation into Russian collusion with the 2016 Trump campaign, he did not intervene. His attempts to force other nations to lower tariffs on American goods were largely unsuccessful. Although Trump campaigned on promises to repeal Obamacare and build a wall on the Mexican border, he did not succeed. He is one of the 3 presidents to be impeached by the House of Representatives. Although he was later acquitted by the Senate, and the COVID-19 pandemic illustrates that the awesome power of the presidency does not always translate into the ability to prevent disaster. Just like the other 44 individuals who have served as president, and like his successor, Joe Biden, Trump was often constrained by factors that were out of his control, from disagreements with the other members of the federal government to the sometimes fickle opinions of the American public. The fact is that the president is but one factor in a complex political system tasked with achieving often impossible goals. This truth that has constrained all presidents, not just Trump. Trump's, at times, unorthodox approach to the office of the presidency raised questions about where the presidential power comes from and what limits are there on its exercise. Did Trump redefine what makes a successful president or a failed one? What factors distinguish the presidential successes from presidential failures? The development of power, of presidential power. As we consider the history of America's 46 presidents, 4 facts stand out. Presidents matter. Their actions have had profound consequences for the nation in both domestic and foreign policy. 2, presidents get their power from a variety of sources, from provisions of the Constitution to their management of the actions by the executive branch of government. 3, presidential power has increased over time, not because of changes in the Constitution, but because of America's growth as a nation. Its presidential emergence as a dominant actor in international politics, the expansion of the federal government, and acts as legislation to have given new authority to the president. 4, there are sharp limits to presidential power. Presidents are often forced to compromise or abandon their plans in the face of public, congressional, or foreign opposition. It is also important to note that while all 46 presidents have been men, and almost all of them have been white, breaking this regularity is only a matter of time. In recent years, in addition, the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, the groundbreaking presidential campaigns of Hillary Clinton in 2016, and the election of Kamala Harris as vice president in 2020, more women as well as minorities, including Senator Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey, Surgeon Ben Carson, and entrepreneur Andrew Yang, have been credible contenders for the party's presidential entrepreneur. Andrew Yang have been credible contenders for their party's presidential nominations. In 2020, Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, became the first openly gay presidential candidate. These lessons are particularly important as we consider the presidency of Donald Trump. Trump's background and behavior in office were often described as being radically different from those of past presidents. Even so, Trump had to contend with the same limits on presidential power faced by his predecessors, including voters, high expectations, unexpected events such as pandemic, natural disaster, or military actions by other countries, conflicts within his own party, as well as being Republican Democrats in Congress, and differences between his goals and those held by federal bureaucrats who implemented the decisions. Understanding how the accomplishments of past presidents were shaped by these constraints can help us begin to analyze and understand the Trump presidency. Early years through World War I. Since the early years of the Republic, presidents' actions have had profound consequences for the nation. President George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson compromises on domestic issues such as choosing a permanent location for the nation's capital, establishing the federal courts, and financing the government. President Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren were instrumental in forming the Democratic Party and its local party organizations. In addition, early presidents made important foreign policy decisions. For example, The Monroe Doctrine, issued by President James Monroe in 1823, stated that America would remain neutral in wars involving European nations, and that these nations must cease attempts to colonize or occupy areas in North and South America. President John Taylor and James Polk oversaw the admission of the huge territory of Texas into the Union following the Mexican-American War, as well as the acquisition of land that later became Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. Presidents also played key roles in the conflict over slavery. President Millard Fillmore's support helped enact the Compromise of 1850, which limited slavery in California, and Franklin Pierce supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which regulated slavery in those territories. And of course, Abraham Lincoln, who helped from the Republican Party in the 1850s, played a transformative role during the Civil War. His orders raised the huge Union Army, and as commander-in-chief, he directed the conduct of the bloody war that ultimately ended slavery and brought the southern states back into the Union. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, presidents were instrumental in federal responses to the nation's rapid expansive and industrialization. The country's growing size and economy generated conflict over which services federal government should provide to citizens and to the extent to which the government should regulate individual and corporate behavior. Various acts of legislation created new federal agencies, as well as new presidential powers and responsibilities. For example, Republican President Theodore Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up the Northern Securities Company, a mammoth nationwide railroad trust. Roosevelt also expanded federal conservation programs and increased the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate businesses. At the same time, the foreign policy initiatives of President Woodrow Wilson illustrated the limits of presidential power. Although he campaigned in the 1916 election on a promise to keep America out of World War I, he ultimately ordered American troops to fight on the side of the Allies after the war. Wilson offered a peace plan, proposed 1, reshaping the border of the European countries in order to prevent future conflicts, and 2, creating an international organization, the League of Nations, to prevent future conflicts, and 3, taking other measures to encourage free trade and democracy. However, America's allies rejected most of Wilson's proposals, and the Senate refused to allow American participation in the League of Nations. The Great Depression through the present. Presidential actions defined the government's response to the Great Depression. The worldwide economic collapse in the late 1920s and 1930s marked high unemployment, huge stock market declines, and many bank failures. After winning the 1932 presidential election, Democrat Franklin Roosevelt and his staff began reshaping American government in an effort to pull the country out of depression. Roosevelt's New Deal reforms created numerous federal agencies and helped individual Americans, and imposed many new corporate regulations. The expansion continued under Roosevelt's successors, even Republican Dwight Eisenhower, whose party had initially opposed many New Deal reforms, presided over the creation of new agencies and the building of the interstate highway system. Presidents were instrumental in the civil rights reforms and expansion of the federal government in the 1960s. With the Congressional approval, President Lyndon Johnson's administration created a wide range of domestic programs such as the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Medicare, Medicaid, and federal funding for schools. The job of enacting voting rights and civil rights legislation also took place during Johnson's presidency. Both Johnson and his successor, Richard Nixon, directed America's involvement in the Vietnam War with the goal of forcing North Vietnamese to abandon their plans to unify North and South Vietnam. But presidential efforts in Vietnam did not meet with success, despite enormous deployments of American forces and the deaths of more than 58,000 American soldiers. Nixon eventually signed an agreement that allowed American troops to leave, but did not end the conflict, which concluded only after a North Vietnamese victory in 1975. The two presidents immediately after Nixon, Republican Gerald Ford and Democrat Jimmy Carter, faced the worst economic conditions since the Great Depression, largely due to the increased energy prices. Both presidents offered plans to reduce unemployment and inflation, restore economic growth, and enhance domestic energy sources. However, their efforts were largely unsuccessful, which became a critical factor in their failed re-election bids. The experience of Ford and Carter highlight that presidents often face situations for which there are no good solutions. Given the realities of the American economy in the 1970s, it's hard to imagine policies that would have improved on Ford and Carter's performance. The political and policy importance of presidential actions continued to increase during the presidency of Republicans Ronald Reagan, despite the fact that he ran on a platform of tax cuts, fewer regulations, and smaller government. Reagan and his staff also negotiated important arms control agreement with the Soviet Union. Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, led American and international participation in the Persian Gulf War during 1990 and 1991, which succeeded in removing Iraqi forces from Kuwait with minimal American casualties. Democrat Bill Clinton's presidency was marked by passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, welfare reform, arms control agreements, and successful peacekeeping efforts by U.S. troops in Haiti and the Balkans. His presidency also was distinguished by having one of the longest periods of economic growth in the U.S. history and the first balanced budgets since the 1960s. President George W. Bush won congressional approval of his tax cuts and education reforms, but he is best remembered for managing America's response to the September 11th attacks, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. President Obama secured several notable changes in foreign domestic policy, including the enactment of health care reform, economic stimulus legislation, and new financial regulations, and the appointment of the 2 Supreme Court justices. I'm going to close in on there because there's stuff that you probably want to write notes on. And here's this. That's all, in case you want to pause. However, Obama had to compromise in enacting many of these new policies, and in such areas such as immigration reform and gun control, he was largely unsuccessful. Obama's experience highlights a fundamental limit on presidential power in many areas. Presidents require congressional support in order to achieve their policy goals. Despite the ways Donald Trump differed from the past presidents, his personal wealth, life outside politics, and willingness to deviate from established norms, the Trump presidency still illustrates both the exercise of presidential power and the limits on presidential action. Trump had considerable success in forcing policy and regulatory changes through administrative actions. However, in many cases, and particularly after regained a House majority in 2019, his plans were blocked by a lack of support, the failure to build majorities in the House and Senate, his unwillingness to fully staff the executive branch because of concerns over disloyalty, and congressional investigations prompted by leaks and whistleblowers' reports. Thus, Trump sometimes looked decisive and influential, but at other times he appeared relatively constrained and weak. Why should I care? Sorry, that was a side note. After presidents leave, their performance is often evaluated as though their powers and foresight during this term had been unlimited. The history of presidential successes and failures reminds us that, in fact, presidents are often constrained by circumstances. Many of the problems past presidents have faced were totally unanticipated or had no good solutions. Other times, attempts to address national needs failed because of congressional resistance. Thus, before we make judgments about presidential performance, we need to understand the president's job and the resources available to accomplish it. I'm going to go ahead and zoom on this, should you want to write that down. The president's job description. This section describes the president's constitutional authority, powers derived from the provisions of the Constitution, and statutory authority, powers that come from laws, as well as the additional capabilities that presidents derive from their positions as the head of the executive branch. Constitutional and statutory powers are summarized in Nuts and Bolts 11.1. As the box indicates, some presidential powers arise from the Constitution, and others derive from a combination of constitutional and statutory authority. Questions about the sources and limits of presidential authority have bedeviled political scientists for several generations. In fact, one very influential book, Richard Newstead's Presidential Power, argued that the main source of was a president's power to persuade people to do what the presidents wanted. Building on more recent research, our aim to show how the provisions that define presidential authority operate in modern-day American politics, what kinds of opportunities and constraints they create for the current president and future holders of the office. This is Nuts and Bolts 11.1, so I will let you write notes if you want. Head of the executive branch. And before I go into that, here are some key terms. Head of the executive branch. A president's responsibility and the source of the presidential power begin with the constitutional responsibilities of the office. The Constitution's vesting clause, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. makes the president the head of the government or the leader of the executive branch, as well as the head of state or the symbolic and political representative of the country. The Constitution also places the president in charge of the implementation of laws, saying, "He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed." Sometimes implementation of a law is nearly automatic, and all the president needs to do is ensure that bureaucrats use proper lawful procedures to accomplish the implementation, as was the case with the part of the 2020 COVID-19 stimulus package that provided $1,200 payments to most Americans. In this case, all the presidents needed to do to implement the directive was to ask Treasury bureaucrats send payments either by direct deposit or mail. More commonly, the president's authority to implement the law requires using judgment to translate legislative goals into programs, budgets, and regulations. For example, another part of the stimulus package directed to the Secretary of Treasury to make grants and loans to firms in order to prevent layoffs and bankruptcies. However, the law did not specify which firms should get these funds or whether any conditions would be applied, repayment terms, guarantees about no layoffs, and so on. All of these provisions were left up to the Treasury bureaucrats, giving them and the president considerable discretion to set the terms of these bailouts. Appointments. The president appoints ambassadors, senior bureaucrats, and members of the federal judiciary, including Supreme Court justices, as head of the executive branch. The president can appoint individuals to about 8,000 positions, ranging from high-profile jobs such as Secretary of State to routine administrative and secretarial positions. About 1,200 of these appointments, generally high-level positions such as cabinet secretaries, require Senate confirmation. The individuals serve at the pleasure of the president, meaning that the president can remove them from their positions whenever he or she likes. Thus, when Donald Trump fired National Security Advisor John Bolton in November of 2019, this action was legitimate exercise of presidential authority, as was Trump's nomination of Robert O'Brien to succeed Bolton. The president also nominates individuals to fill federal judgeships, including Supreme Court justices, although these nominations require Senate approval in order to take effect. Because these positions are lifetime appointments, they enable the president to put people into positions of power who will remain after the president leaves office. For example, President Trump nominated many young conservative justices to federal judgeships during his presidency, including Supreme Court Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced his name. Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. The full effects of these and future judicial appointments by Trump's will not be completely apparent for years to come. The need for Senate confirmation of the president's appointment is one of the fundamental limits on presidential power. Historically, the Senate's approved virtually all nominees without much debate or controversy, although in recent years, senators, particularly Republicans during Obama's presidency, have blocked votes on judicial and agency nominees. Some of the Trump's cabinet appointees, including Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, were approved only because Vice President Mike Pence, who is the president of the Senate under the Constitution, voted to break a tie. In several cases, Trump has named individuals to serve as acting cabinet secretaries. These positions do not require Senate confirmation, but the office holders can serve only for a limited time. If the Senate is in recess, adjourned for more than 3 days, the president can make a recess appointment, whereby an appointee is temporarily given a position without a Senate vote and holds the office until the beginning of the next congressional session. All presidents make recess appointments, but typically for relatively minor offices and for non-controversial nominees. For example, when the Republican-controlled Senate refused to vote on President Obama's 2016 Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, it would have been highly unusual and perhaps unconstitutional for President Obama to appoint Garland to the Supreme Court via a recess appointment. In any case, the Senate can, and sometimes does, eliminate the possibility of recess appointments by holding brief working sessions as often as needed to ensure that no recess lasts more than 3 days. Executive orders. Presidents have the power to issue executive orders, that is, proclamations that unilaterally change government policy without subsequent congressional consent, as well as other kinds of orders that change policy, such as national security, presidential directives, and presidential findings. See how it works. Feature in this chapter for example, one of President Trump's orders in April 2020 put strict limits. Excuse me, I lost my place. It is Tuesday, guys. You got to bear with me. For example, one of Trump's orders in April put strict limits on immigration for 60 days. Another order used Trump's authority under the Defense Production Act to order companies to increase production of face masks during the coronavirus pandemic. As the What Do You Say facts feature, all presidents issue many executive orders. Most are consequential, like the annual order that gives federal employees an early dismissal on the last working day before Christmas. Some executive orders implement large changes in federal policy. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was issued as an executive order. Similarly, President Trump issued a series of executive orders that have reduced the number of refugees admitted to the United States each year from about 70,000 per year during the Obama administration to only about 18,000 in 2019. Executive orders may appear to give the president authority to do whatever he or she wants, even when facing strong opposition from Congress. However, particularly during the Trump administration, executive orders have been used to signal intentions rather than directly change policy. For example, one of the Trump's executive orders directed the Border Patrol to end its catch and release policy, whereby people caught trying to enter the United States from Mexico illegally were simply escorted back to a border checkpoint and set free. However, the order did not command the Border Patrol to hold all illegal immigrants for trial. It instructed the agency to determine what change would be needed to implement his practice. In the main, when the president issues an order that makes real policy changes and Congress does not respond, it means that congressional majorities agree with president's actions, or there is already a law giving the president the authority that he or she is exercising in the order. That said, presidents often turn to executive orders and other directives when they know they cannot secure congressional support for the policy changes they want to implement, as was likely the case for Trump's executive. Let me show this. I hope you can read this. Orders restricting immigration on Obama's executive orders for limiting deportations of so-called dreamers, who are undocumented individuals brought to the United States as children. While members of Congress can overrule the president, they may be too busy with other matters to do so, or simply not care enough about the change to take the steps needed to undo it. Commander-in-Chief. The Constitution makes the president the commander-in-chief of America's military forces, but gives Congress the power to declare war. These provisions are potentially contradictory, and the Constitution leaves open the broader question of who controls the military. In practice, however, the president controls day-to-day military operations through the Department of Defense and has the power to order troops into action without explicit congressional approval. For example, both the Trump and Obama administrations joined over a dozen other nations to aid rebel forces in the Syrian civil war. They provided arms and training to rebel fighters and conducted airstrikes against ISIS and Syrian government forces. Even today, some American group forces remain in Syrian territory, and limited airstrikes continue. Similarly, the 2011 attack on Osama bin Laden's compound and the 2020 drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani were carried out without prior congressional approval. In fact, even though the United States has been involved in hundreds of military conflicts, there have been only 5 declarations of war: the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War in 1846, the Spanish-American War in 1898, World War I, 1917, and World War II, 1941. As a way of restraining the presidential war-making power, Congress enacted the War Powers Resolution of 1973, nuts and bolts 11.2, lists the specific provisions of the resolution. However, a 2019 study found that the War Powers Resolution has been formally used by Congress to limit presidential authority only once, to limit the duration of deployment of Marines in Lebanon on peacekeeping mission. Moreover, although it has been in effect for nearly 40 years, it has never faced Supreme Court. Some scholars have even argued that resolutions actually expand presidential power because it gives the president essentially unlimited control for the first 90 days of a military operation. And in many cases, 90 days is more than enough time to complete military action without getting Congress involved. Even with its limitations, the War Powers Resolution has had some impacts on presidential decisions regarding the use of force. Threats by members of Congress to invoke the War Powers Resolution were one fact in President Obama's 2011 decision to curtail American involvement in the NATO-led mission to end Libyan civil war. The impact of the War Powers Resolution is also evident in the fact that presidents often consult with congressional leaders or try to gain congressional approval before committing troops to battle. It is important to remember, too, that the act is not the only tool available to members of Congress who disagree with the president's policy. They can curb a president's war-making powers through budget restrictions, legislation, legislative prohibitions, public appeals, and ultimately impeachment. I will go zone in on the war powers of 1973, so I hope you can read that. And then this is one of the terms: treaty making and foreign policy. Treaty making power is shared between Congress and the president. Presidents and their staff negotiate treaties which are then sent to the Senate for approval. Many need the support of a 2/3 majority of senators to be approved, but some need only a simple majority. However, the president has a first mover advantage in the treaty-making process. Congress considers treaties only after negotiations have ended. There is no way for members of Congress to force the president to negotiate a treaty or limits its scope. That said, the need for congressional approval often leads presidents to consider senators' preference when negotiating treaties, which often results in significant compromise between the two branches. Presidents have two strategies for avoiding a congressional treaty vote. One is to announce that the United States will voluntarily aid by a treaty without ratifying it. In the case of the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change, one of the reasons why President Obama supported voluntary targets for reductions in greenhouse gases was that such an agreement did not require Senate approval. Of course, this strategy allowed Obama's successor, Donald Trump, to unilaterally withdraw from this agreement in 2017. It is also possible to structure a deal as an executive agreement between the executive branch and a foreign government, which does not require Senate approval. This strategy was followed in the case of the deal between the United States, its allies, and the Iranian government to curtail Iran's nuclear weapons research program. In this case, Congress passed and the President Obama signed a law giving members 30 days to review the deal and the opportunity to pass a resolution rejecting it. The deal ultimately went into effect, although Donald Trump ended the United States participation in early 2018. The president also serves as the principal representative of the United States in the foreign affairs other than, treaty negotiations. Presidential duties include communicating with foreign leaders, non-governmental organizations, and even ordinary citizens to persuade them to act in ways that the president believes are attended the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where he met with leaders of the European Union, as well as the Prime Minister and other officials from Iraq. While such meetings generally have no direct effect on policy, they signal presidential interest and highlight the importance of ongoing negotiations and joint efforts to address issues of mutual concern. The amount of time the administration devotes to foreign policy is subject to domestic and world events and therefore not entirely under presidential control. While President Trump promised to limit overseas military operations, he largely continued his predecessor's policies. In the case of North Korea, Trump's public pressure on the North Korean regime, including threats to respond with fire and fury if North Korea were to attack the United States, was a departure from the Obama administration. In terms of tone, as was Trump's willingness to hold 2 meetings with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, even so, there were a few observable policy differences between Trump's and Obama's policy toward North Korea as well as Syria, as Trump ultimately removed U.S. troops from the conflict there. I'll zone in on State of the Union. And then here is the presidential vetoes from H.W. Bush to Trump. There we go. Sometimes it doesn't want to zone in. Legislative power. The Constitution establishes lawmaking as shared power between the president and Congress and compromise between the 2 branches. It's fundamental to passing laws that satisfy both. The president recommends policies and legislative priorities to Congress, notably in the State of the Union, notably in the annual State of the Union address. President and their legislative staff also work with Congress to develop legislative proposals. They spend considerable time lobbying members of Congress to support their proposals and negotiating with legislative leaders over policy details. Although the president cannot formally introduce legislation, it is typically easy to find a member of Congress willing to sponsor a presidential proposal. The president's legislative power also stems from the ability to veto legislation. Once both chambers of Congress have passed a bill by simply majority, the president must decide within 2 weeks whether to sign it or issue a veto. Signed bills become law, but vetoed bills return to the House and Senate for a vote to override the veto. If both chambers enact the bill again with at least 2/3 majority, the bill becomes law. Otherwise, it is defeated. If Congress adjourns before the president has made a decision, the president can pocket veto the proposal by not responding to it. Pocket vetoes cannot be overridden, but congressional leaders can avoid them by keeping Congress in session for 2 weeks after a bill is enacted. Figure 11.1 shows the number of vetoes issued by recent presidents and the number overridden by Congress. In general, vetoes are most likely to occur under divided government. When a president from one party faces a House and Senate controlled by the other party, in the case of Obama, the relatively small number of vetoes reflects a sharp reduction in the number of laws enacted by Congress. Vetoes are much less likely under unified government when one party controls both Congress and the presidency, because the chances are much higher than that the president and legislators from his or her party hold similar policy priorities. Thus, in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, when a Republican president faced a Republican Congress, the president did not veto any legislation. A president's veto threats also allow the president to specify what kinds of proposals he or she is willing or unwilling to accept from Congress. Legislators then know that they need to write a proposal that attracts 2/3 support in both House or else accede to the president's demands. Here's take a stand. I will zone in on that so that you may read that at your leisure. Pardons and commutations. The Constitution gives the president several additional powers, including the authority to pardon people convicted of federal crimes or reduce their sentences. The only limit on this power is that the president cannot pardon anyone who has been impeached and convicted by Congress. Thus, if a president is removed from office via impeachment, he or she can neither pardon himself or herself, nor be pardoned when the vice president assumes the presidency. Although most presidential pardons attract little attention, some have been extremely controversial. Many of Obama's pardons involved individuals with no prior criminal record who had been sentenced to long prison terms for nonviolent drug offenses. Obama also pardoned Army Private Chelsea Manning, who had been convicted of leaking classified information into the WikiLeaks organization. Donald Trump issued relatively few pardons. Notably, in 2017, President Trump pardoned former Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who had been convicted of contempt of court for refusing a judge's order to stop racial profiling in police traffic stops. In 2020, Trump pardoned financier Michael Milken for securities fraud crimes committed in the 1980s, and also commuted the sentence of his longtime friend and former campaign advisor Roger Stone, who had been convicted of 7 felonies, including witness tampering and lying to federal investigators. Executive privilege. Finally, although this power is not formally set out in the Constitution or statute, all presidents have claimed to hold the power of executive privilege. This refers to the ability to shield themselves and their subordinates from revealing White House discussions, decisions, or documents, including emails to members of the legislative or judicial branches of government. I'll zone in on executive privilege so that you can write that down for your terminology. Although claims of executive privilege have been made since the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, it is still not clear what falls under the privilege and what does not. See Take the Stand feature. In the 1974 case, United States versus Nixon, a special prosecutor appointed by the Justice Department to investigate the Watergate scandal challenged President Richard Nixon's claims of executive privilege to force him to hand over tapes of potentially incriminating Oval Office conversations involving Nixon and his senior aides. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that executive privilege does not exist, but that the privilege is not absolute. The court's decision required Nixon to release the tapes, which proved his involvement with attempts to cover up the scandal. But the ruling did not clearly state the conditions under which a future president could withhold such information. Claims of executive privilege present a dilemma. On the one hand, members of Congress need to know what is happening in the executive branch in the case of President Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Claims of executive privilege allowed the Watergate cover-up continue for more than a year and would have kept this information secret permanently if the Supreme Court had ruled in Nixon's favor. Exercising executive privilege can also weaken accountability to the public, as restricting information may leave the average voter unaware of what an administration is doing. On the other hand, the president and his or her staff need to be able to communicate freely and discuss alternative strategies, hypothetical situations, or national security secrets without the fear that they will be forced to reveal conversations that could become politically embarrassing or costly. This is the end of Chapter 11, Part 1.